Hey everybody, today is March 9th, and this is a special request video, so let's get into it. The request was to talk about the ego and the Po. Now, quick review, basic, very simple overview. The ego, the id, and the id, the ego, and the superego, where the id would roughly correspond to the unconscious mind, which would roughly correspond to the peripheral and enteric nervous system. The ego would roughly correspond to the subconscious mind, which would roughly correspond to the reptilian brain, the lower central nervous system, and then the superego mostly to the consciousness and the cortex, right? Now, those are really rough things, but what's happening is that the Western science is trying to get to a good description of psychology, and then later on, of course, as we knew more about anatomy, they started to kind of finagle that and change, and it's all the subject to change in the future. It's important to know that these concepts that were in German philosophy and psychology early on came from Taoist thought. And you can study up on Carl Jung's work and how he based it. And then he took what he wanted and then he changed other things. That's fine. Every society has their own psychology development. I think Tibetan Buddhism probably has the most developed psychological models out there. But at any rate, so when we talk about the ego, what I like to do, though, is not talk about the ego in the way people are talking about the ego, because what they really mean is what we call the human mind or the human mentality. And I relegate the ego to the ego sauce. So I turn it into a material. And that's for alchemical reasons, but I'm going to get into that for a second. Now, as regards the subconscious mind, now we start to talk about the hardwiring in the body and the Po. Now, the Po are these corporeal souls. Now, if you said you had one, then it would be stored in the lungs. But they're in a case where the Po have gone bad, there are 7 different Po, and there's like sinking and rotting and stinking and all these others. So the 7 Po, which you can look up on Wikipedia, are really describing perverted states of the organs. And this energy rises up from the organs, it bubbles up through the hardwiring of the subconscious system, the connection between the enteric nervous system and the lower part of the brain, so your pons, medulla, your cerebellum, the limbic system, and it rises up in there, and then it causes changes from below, which we would say usually it's going to be heat and wind. It could be phlegm, though, and then that affects the conscious mind and literally the intellect. So the intellect is sort of downwind from all of these things that are happening. The Po, when they are corrupted, let's take the case of alcoholism or addiction, either one. When the Po is corrupted, it's what we call a stirring yin. And when one yin stirs, they will all stir. And it doesn't really matter what kind of yin it is. It could be a gambling addiction gets stirred up. It could be a sex addiction, or it could even be just anger, constantly getting angry over the tiniest thing. These are the signs of disordered Po. The nervous system has been altered and inhibited. There is blockage within it. And if the channels are tubes, just imagine putting dirt and roots and rocks all throughout that, and now can the flow work correctly? No. What are some things that can disturb the Po? Sugars, alcohols, caffeine, drugs, pharmaceutical included, but also emotions, stress, psychological attacks. All these things can get in the channels and interrupt their flow. And once that happens, you can have really strange disturbances. I had a patient yesterday, perfectly mentally healthy, but her liver is waking her up at exactly 3 a.m. when the channels change from liver to lung. Now, that is not a coincidence, because I've had several, maybe perhaps 4 patients that have had that exact same thing. Every one of them is a liver case. So what we see there is that the Po are disturbed and they're moving. And not all the time does it lead to alcoholism. It can cause other kinds of problems in the body. In some cases, though, it does lead to sort of an internal haunting, and sort of like ghosts on the outside, but instead it's from the inside. And that could be memories, regrets, rapes, traumas, PTSD, all these different kinds of conditions, including the really strange ones, Stockholm Syndrome, or, the Hurt Locker kind of syndrome. I treated a guy for that. And those energies, when they rise up, are what we would call a perversion of the correct flow of the chi. So now, that brings us back to ego and the ego sauce. There's a belief out there in the spiritual circles that you have to destroy the ego. This is false. First of all, you can't destroy the ego. You'll only hurt yourself. And secondly, if you abuse the human mind, you will end up abusing yourself and causing it to become a depraved soul in you. So it's like schisming yourself. Okay. Now, I'm not saying you shouldn't upbraid yourself and hold yourself to a higher standard. You absolutely should. Everybody should hold themselves to a pretty strong standard. There are also times, though, when you have to reward it for its animal needs, which could be mating needs, like biological needs. It could be hungers, up to and including a few lusts. You can't obviously just let it run the gamut and become a hedonist or a nihilist and whatever it goes. Become a Kafka-esque kind of person. It doesn't matter, nothing. That's a perversion of the energy as well. So what I'd like you to do is think of the ego as a vat of, like, there's a certain amount. So there's a right time to use the ego and there's a wrong time to use the ego. Here are the things that I want you to remember that it's permissible to use the ego without losing heaven's will. Mating, and in general, just being a lover. Survival. And that could mean a broad range of things, but in general, if you need to fight for some kind of survival for yourself or for anyone else around you, or for a business or anything, that would be one. And then the last one would be humor and charm. Okay, I'm mixing those together, but more or less getting people to like you. Why is that necessary? Because it's much better if people like you than if they don't like you. Right? You're going to make better sales. You're going to have a better life. And people want to like you. They want to like you. When I was young, people didn't like me. Why? Because I didn't control the ego sauce very well. Also, I was a bit metally. And the more metally I was, the more I insulted my wood, so then more ego. Because ego is associated with a liver and with the wood element. It's a young thing, right? The young phase of life is the wood phase. And, of course, wood is associated with the phallus. So men have a general problem with pride and arrogance. Okay, so once you get that under control and you can control the ego sauce, it can make you money. This is an important thing. Profit comes from Jing. Profit comes from Jing. I'm not saying it comes from semen in the groin, although salesmen do use a lot of sexual energy, salesmen or saleswomen, to get from the water phase to generate some kind of profit. So long term, that can be damaging to the health. But you need to use the ego sauce at the right time. If I'm teaching, I'm using the ego sauce. But otherwise, I try to remain in a receptive mode. Every once in a while, a patient has to push a few buttons, and for their case, I also have to use the ego sauce. You have to believe in yourself. You have to believe that you can do it, and you are running your life. If you don't believe that to a certain degree, right, you can be religious and go, it's all in God's hands, or it's in a greater force's hands. That's totally true. We're not arguing that, but we are saying that for the healthiness of the subconscious mind, you have to believe to some degree you have an influence or control, that there is a destiny that you can reach. So if you can't reach for that, it will harm the body in other areas. It will harm also the psyche in other areas, and you will start to sever body and spirit. And then that's when cults are started, and people are trying to escape all the time. They're doing outer body, and they shouldn't be doing outer body because they don't have the proper training. So learn to use this ego sauce appropriately. And if you have an excess of it, or you think that you may have an excess of it, and you feel guilty about that, then consider transforming it into a different type of material substance. This is all internally done, right? We're talking the lead and the mercury. But still, don't think of it as destruction, right? We are not trying to beat the human mind to a pulp. We are trying to accept the mind of Tao, or the Christ-like mind, or the Krishna-like mind in the heart chakra, right? The true mind of the Sheen, the heart mind, or what we might call the mind lord. We're trying to accept that We're not trying to crush the E, which is the intellect. You need to have, to some degree, an amount of ego. All the best shows you watch, all the best stories that are written, all contain large amounts of ego. It's an extremely attractive substance. One of the parts that makes the Odyssey such an important story, or the Ulysses story, is that he had so much ego and he had so much going for him, and life did beat him up. And then he managed to control that, and at the end, though, he still utilizes it, and he's young enough to get his revenge. It's a very captivating story, and that's why it's been around for thousands of years. No one likes to hear a person who doesn't have any confidence, and they just kind of beat themselves up all the time. It's a waste of everyone's time, and complaining all the time is not of use to anybody. If you're having one of those days, keep to yourself, nourish the ego. Feed yourself some humor, feed yourself food that you like, comfort food, and just remember that you're going to be okay. You're going to be okay. Now, if you have a friend or somebody that maybe they're a narcissist and they're really struggling with the ego sauce, you can't just get theirs, right? Because it's actually going to harm your ego if you're around that. So you have to be very careful about that. And you can try and help them, but more or less it's an inward journey figuring that out. Okay, try that, and good luck, and I hope that you have a very nice day.